All right, so I'm not sure where it stands because let's see, which way am I supposed to do? Am I good? Okay, but I can't see it now. Yes, I can. All right, so today I am just excited to welcome to our virtual stage someone who is a noted scholar, a noted historian, a noted lawyer. Annette Gordon-Reed is a Pulitzer Prize winning author. She's won a National Book Award. She is one of the seminal experts on Thomas Jefferson and Sally Hemings. And she is also my friend. She has been a professor at NYU and is currently the Carl Lowe Professor, University Professor at Harvard College and Harvard Law School. She is also someone who values the intersectionality of law and history and has once again shown how that happens in her latest book and her latest New York Times bestseller, On Juneteenth. So thank you for joining us today, Annette. We're excited to have you.
I'm very glad to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
So let's jump right in. I talked about your latest book on Juneteenth and talked about how, or I didn't talk about the fact that you're from Conroe, Texas. Can you talk about what inspired you to write on Juneteenth and, you know, why you thought it was important for you to talk, to write that book?
Well, first I'd like to say thank you very much for inviting me. I'm happy to be here with you. You didn't tell people the most important part. We're classmates from Harvard. And so that means we've known each other longer than we probably want to say out loud. But I'm very glad to be here. Well, you know, I decided to write this book because, well, a number of things. First, my editor has been asking me to do a book about Texas for a number of years. And he wanted me to do a big book about Texas. And, you know, I was putting it off and putting it off. And this past year, during the pandemic, when I was at home, because Harvard had gone to teaching, you know, virtually, I commute between New York and Cambridge usually, but once they went virtual, it made no sense for me to sit in my apartment in Cambridge by myself and do classes online. I decided to stay here in New York with my husband and do classes online. And you remember what that was like. We were not supposed to be running around, going out and doing very many things at all. Most of our recreation was going out to Central Park and walking around for exercise. So I was at home quite a bit. And I was also thinking about my family, thinking about my mother and my father, how they would, who are no longer living. And I was wondering how they would respond to this event, you know, to the pandemic, how they would see it. And the more I thought about them, the more nostalgic that I got, thinking about how much I miss them and how I wish that they were here. And I got the idea when my editor said, you know, maybe we should, you know, came back to me thinking that maybe I should do some book about Texas. I had written an essay about Juneteenth for the New Yorker and a book review of 5 books for the New York Review of Books. And he reminded me of that and said, well, maybe you might think of doing something about Texas. And I wanted, after thinking about my parents, to do something personal, something very different from the types of books that I typically write. You know, the Hemings is a Monticello is 800 pages. It's probably more endnotes than, is longer than On Juneteenth. And so I wanted to do something different. And I wanted to write about my parents and my life with them. So that's why I decided to do this book. It's a personal, out of sort of personal, emotional reasons to want to make contact with my family, and to reminisce and to think about all of those things in the middle of this pandemic. And so I had time on my hands, and that's why that's what I used the time for, was to get this book out, to do research, such research that I could do online, because the archives are closed. But I didn't want it to be, it's a scholarly book, but as I said, it's not the Hemingses of Monticello. It's more essay-like, and it's more, more personal, and I hope more accessible to people of all ages.
Thank you for that. And I have to tell you that we were really struck, or at least I was struck by the fact that you almost felt an infringement on Juneteenth with everyone embracing it.
Yeah.
Talk about that a bit.
Well, I felt this, I had this sentiment mainly when I was in college. And I came, from Texas up to New Hampshire to Dartmouth, and I began to hear other people talk about Juneteenth, and it sort of shocked me that they knew about it, because to me, it was a Black Texas holiday. This was even just a couple of years before it became a state holiday in Texas, but it was, when I was growing up, it was mainly Black people who celebrated Juneteenth. And, I had this sense of possessiveness about it, because, people tend to want to be parts of clubs, exclusive things. And I thought this was sort of an exclusive thing. This is something that happened in Texas, and it belonged to us. And then as I thought about it, what we're talking about here is commemorating one phase, one part of the emancipation of African-American people. Emancipation was a process. There was the Emancipation Proclamation. There was, in the fall of Richmond in Virginia, Juneteenth. Other places have days that they look to talk about emancipation. Enslaved people ran away. They liberated themselves. So it wasn't any one thing, but I thought anytime there's sort of the sort of legal act, General Order number 3, that says slavery is over in this place, in the largest state in the Union, I saw that as an advance in human rights. So any advance in human rights doesn't just belong to any one state, any one town, any one place. Other people can celebrate it. Other people are benefited by that. And so I kind of changed my attitude about it and thought, no, it makes sense for us all to celebrate this. And when we do Juneteenth, we can talk about all these other places that have their moments when emancipation came to the people in their particular area. So I got over being possessive, and I am all for, I was at the ceremony the other day in Washington, and it was one of the most moving things that I've experienced. And I was so glad to be a part of that, and not a twinge of possessiveness or anything in me at all, watching that unfold.
Thank you. Well, thank you for sharing. So today, at the Chicago Urban League, we launched or relaunched our nextONE program, which is our Black Business Accelerator.
Mm-hmm.
And we did it on Juneteenth intentionally. Can you give a piece of advice for Black business owners that they might learn from Juneteenth?
Mm-hmm. Well, I think the message that I have taken from Juneteenth, before I wrote the book, and certainly after I wrote the book and doing the research for the book, is the importance of resilience and perseverance. I mean, I marvel at people who, in the midst of a lot of difficult circumstances, in the midst of a lot of hostility, still kept a sense of purpose, and still had a sense of purpose that wasn't just about them. It was a sense of purpose about the community as a whole, I believe. And that was one of the things that helped sustain them. One of the most moving moments when I was writing this book was when I found a voter registration list with my great-great-grandfather's name on it in 1867. This is 2 years after Juneteenth, June 19th, the first, the reading of General Order number 3. And here he was showing up at the beginning to exercise his rights as a citizen. So I think the sense of purpose, the sense of perseverance, connection to community, maintaining ties to community, helping one another, which is also a part of Juneteenth, the bringing together of the community and the family. Those are the things that I think all of us in business, as parents, all of those things are things that we can benefit from. Their example of sticking to it, even in the face of terrible circumstances, because, people celebrated in those days, in those early days, and there are also records of them being whipped for it and punished for it. But nevertheless, they kept on. There were 4 men in Houston, Texas, who pooled their resources and bought land together and had, created a space for African Americans to come and commemorate Juneteenth. And they eventually called it Emancipation Park. This was 1876. Emancipation Park is still there in Houston. I have been to Emancipation Park for Juneteenth celebrations. And this notion of working together for a common goal and creating something, making something concrete, that's still with the idea that this is something that will continue, and it has continued. And so that joint effort, none of them had money enough on their own to do this, but when they pooled their resources, they were able to give something to the community that has lasted up until this day. So, I think the perseverance of these people, the resilience of these people, the public spiritedness of these people, the communal effort of these people has been central to the story. And this is why we have if it hadn't been for that stick-to-itiveness, this holiday would have died out a long time ago. But they did stick to it, and they made it something that, President Biden is talking about the other day and signing before the Black Caucus and other people, because of the efforts of Black people over the years.
You talk about the signing of the Juneteenth holiday legislation by President Biden. And of course, about 2 weeks ago, he went down to Tulsa and talked about Black Wall Street, again with the Black Caucus. What do you see as the significance of these actions by President Biden, and how might we use them to the benefit of our country?
Well, I think it's enormously significant because you have an American president, recognizing the terrible things that have happened to Black people, what Black people have had to go through to try to make it in this society. You think of Greenwood and you think of Tulsa, a place where people had built businesses on their own within their community, causing resentment. There's no question that a lot of that carnage grew out of a jealousy and a sense that Black people were stepping outside of their place. It's funny, today, people will say, well, the reason you have things is because, everybody's giving stuff to you. The government is giving you things. The government is affirmative action. All those kinds of things is justification for Black success. And critical about that. And then you had these people in the past where the government didn't give them anything. The government was against them. All the forces of society were against them, and they managed to build businesses, to be doctors, lawyers, business owners, entrepreneurs, they managed to do those things. And when the opportunity came, they burned it down. So when they say we get something for nothing, they're disdainful. Some people are disdainful. And back then, when these people worked on their own and built something, they were still disdainful. So I think to have a president who is a white man, obviously, to say these things out loud from that position, to talk about these things, is a good lesson to young people and to, to Americans in general, that this is serious business. There are explanations for why there's a gap in Black wealth in this country, and that has persisted over the years. Even though Blacks have access to jobs, building wealth requires access to housing and homes. And we know that housing authorities and people, FHA, we know in the past was involved with redlining and preventing Black people from having home ownership at the same levels as whites, thus, basically slowing down the acquisition of wealth. So the president saying this, and I think what you have to do is to make sure that his saying these things are important, but that he follows through with actions on this part. And that comes from, people who have connections, who can get to him, who could talk to him about this, to keep it on the agenda. We have to keep talking about these kinds of things and making it plain that our support is contingent upon actions that merit our support, but will give us the reason to support him. And I think he understands that. From everything that I've read and heard him say, he seems to get it. But we have to hold the feet to the fire. I mean, words are important, and the words are always important, but actions are what we're really looking for.
Say actions speak louder than words.
Absolutely.
So you are the biographer of one of the patron saints of the Urban League movement, and it was so exciting to hear you talk about him during his death earlier this year, as he was being remembered all over the world, really. Can you talk about some words of wisdom that he gave, or just some things that you learned from that experience?
Oh my goodness. I could be here for days. I just got back from Washington today, and every time I go down there, I miss him so much. Every time I go down there, and I did this time as well, just in a split second, I thought to myself, I should call Mr. Jordan and we should go out to dinner. It just left my mind what had happened, because that was the thing that I would do if I went down to Washington, let him know that Annette Gordon-Reed, is what he always called me, was in town. I learned so much from him. He was wonderful to me, a wonderful friend, a mentor, like a father to me. He was exasperating in the sense that he was always right. Anything we argued about, he was always right. If he wasn't right immediately, if it wasn't apparent immediately that he was right, it could be a year, it could be 2 years, but what he said was going to happen almost invariably happened. And I didn't want to admit that because I had my own opinions, my own ideas, and so forth. But I think that was one of the reasons he was valued as a mentor to people and as an advisor to people. People wonder, what is it about him? What kind of training did he have? What is it about him? But he had impeccable judgment. I mean, nobody is perfect. I'm not saying that every single thing he did was perfect and worked out, but his batting average on this was way higher than other people, because he'd had so many experiences writing this book with him. And, a lot of stuff is not even in the book. I mean, the book, we couldn't go on and on and on and on, but he had done so many things. He'd seen so many things, had so many experiences that's one, and being incredibly intelligent and observant person too, but just the number of experiences that he'd had in the different venues gave him a sense of human nature, the way human beings operate. And so that's why he could be right all the time. He always told me one of the things that I remember is that he said, you have to protect yourself. If you're doing talks, if you're doing, trips and things like that, the organizers will have their ideas about what to do, and you'll have your ideas about what to do. But remember that they are inclined, as people are, to make things more convenient for themselves than you. So he was very protective be protective of your time and be protective of yourself, your body, all those kinds of things, just assess situations realistically and in a clear-eyed way. I could just go on. It's hard to, I would like to write something about this someday, to talk about just the kind of influence that he had on me. But the main thing is his judgment and his sense of, his comfort in himself and his capacities and his desire for Black people. He really did have, he was what you would call, in the old days, they would have called a race man, a racial uplift person. That's what he did. He had Black doctors. He did, dentist, whatever. He was full square into the idea that Black people should be helping one another, and that talented Black people who had things, had a responsibility to help other people. And so when he leaves the Urban League and he goes to Aiken Gump, and there was some criticism of that, and we talk a little bit about this in the book, because people said, well, you've been doing all of these, these civil rights things. Why don't you stay there forever and whatever? But it was a challenge for him. He wanted to see if he could do it. And he thought he could, and he did. He did very well, because he understood that the skills that he had learned at the Urban League, United Negro College Fund, all those places would stand him in good stead, because this is all about people, right? Managing people, knowing people, contacts, and so forth. And so he knew he could do it, and he wanted to try it. And I remember once, I'm sorry, I'm going on like this. You asked me, so I'm going on. But you're fine. No, I remember I did an interview with I think the Journal or somebody was doing an article about him. And this woman was saying, oh, why did he leave the Urban League? He should have stayed where he was, and he should have stayed in the not-for-profit world, and blah, 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 blah. And, I was listening to this, and then later on, after we finished the interview, she mentioned that she asked me where my kids went to school. And then she mentioned that she was looking for a school for her children. And she asked me about Dalton, I think it was, and my kids didn't go to Dalton, but she asked me about this, this ritzy private school. And she was talking to me about her home in the country. And I thought, so you think she's a reporter, and on a reporter's salary, she probably wouldn't be able to send a kid to Dalton and have an apartment in New York and a country home in the Hamptons. So she expected her husband to provide that for her. She expected that kind of life. But Mrs. Jordan shouldn't have had that. That's all that I thought. It's like, wait a minute, why is it that you have these things, but you want him to stay in a place that paid well, but was not Aiken Gump? And why do you deserve that? But Mrs. Jordan, what if he wanted to provide that for his wife? It's enough for you, but your kids could go to these places, but they would be on scholarship, or you wouldn't have a second home. So I think, and he, there was something about him. I mean, people wanted him to stay in a particular place. And even though he didn't stay in that place, once he gets to Aiken Gump, he is still mentoring people. He is still seeing, this kid came to see him one time, to talk to him, because there were always kids coming to talk to him about stuff. And he didn't think the kid was dressed properly. So he took him out and bought him a suit. And I mean, he was doing stuff like that all the time. And he never gave up his connection to Black people and his sense of responsibility to Black people, wherever he was. There's so many people in the corporate world, so many people in government, so many people around who come to me and tell me about things that he did for them, ways that he helped them, when he could have just gone to Aiken Gump and said, forget about it. I'm doing for myself, and go on from there. So, I mean, I'm going to stop because I could just go on. He was one of the most important people in my life, without a doubt.
We're so grateful for you providing that personal testimony. So over the last year, we have seen just an incredible outcry for social justice. And we know that the Urban League, Chicago Urban League, and the Urban League movement fights for racial equity for Black people, but also for all people.
Mhm.
We've seen the murder of George Floyd, the murder of Breonna Taylor, and countless others. And we've seen, for the first time, at least that I can remember, a movement in the corporate arena that somehow seems a bit different, and that many have said is different.
Mhm.
And so there are a lot of folks who say that this is the breakthrough that we've been looking for centuries.
Uh-huh.
And that it's somehow different from the civil rights movement, that it's somehow different from all of the movements that have happened and that have really seemed to provide promise for Black people in the past.
Mhm.
Do you think that this time is different? And if so, why? Or why not?
Well, it's different, but I don't know that it's necessarily the ultimate breakthrough. It's different because there are more Black people in places of authority than there were when we're talking about the civil rights movement. And this goes back to Mr. Jordan. It was a big deal for Mr. Jordan to be on corporate boards. Well, now there are Blacks on corporate boards, and they're Black. There have been Black CEOs, Black partners in law firms. Not enough, but they are there. So I think that I have been doing a lot of Juneteenth related talks at corporations at the invitation of probably young, from what I gather from looking at the Zoom calls, the people who are in charge of it. I mean, there are all kinds of people who are coming to them, but there are Black people in positions of power in corporations now in ways we didn't have before. So that's different. They can set the agenda. They can alert people to things, because obviously a lot of people would not have heard of Juneteenth before. A lot of corporate people wouldn't have heard of it. There had to be Black people there, probably Black people there to say, hey, there's this day and we think you ought to celebrate it. So that's different. The jury's out for me on whether or not this is the moment, whatever the moment, however you define that this is going to be the big deal that we all hope that it would be. I would have thought, I mean, last year during the pandemic, during the pandemic, there was, support all around. I was astonished by the number and the size of marches about the murder of George Floyd, people saying Black Lives Matter, not just in the United States, not just in major cities, but in every state of the union and all over the world. So that created a lot of hope in me that this was a big breakthrough. And it was, that's unprecedented, you know, all that kind of movement together all around the same time, everybody doing this. But I have heard sort of mixed reports on whether that enthusiasm has remained, that some of that has waned over time. Now, it may be that we push forward and we'll come back, but not at the point where we were before. That's a little bit better than it was before. We've moved the needle in some sense, but it's not clear to me what the outcome of all this will be. We're in a real problem now, not just in terms of race, but in terms of the American political system. We're in an unprecedented situation. I mean, people stormed the Capitol of the United States. And there are people who are elected officials who think that that was okay, or who seem, you know, really sanguine about it. And if we lose the democracy, if we lose a sort of idealistic America, we all know that America has not lived up to its ideals, but there are ideals to pursue. But if we do away with the pursuit of those ideals and the notion of a democratic republic where people, you know, who are eligible to vote can vote. I mean, the racial part of it is it's serious, and they're starting with us in a way, and voter suppression, we understand that. But if that goes by the wayside, everybody's going to have huge problems, because the only hope we really had was people believing, well, not the only hope, but a major hope that we had was people believing that America had a creed that promoted notions of equality. And even if it didn't hold up to that, I mean, every Black leader has mentioned that, has used that. King used it in the March on Washington to say, look, these are ideals, this is what we should be fighting for. But we have people now who don't seem to believe that, who believe in minority rule, and that other people who vote differently than they are illegitimate and shouldn't be allowed to vote. Or if a person is elected from another party, you strip them of their power. This is really, really serious. And I study the creation of the American Republic. The early American history is my forte, and I'm sort of looking at this like, this is so far from anything that people would have thought, that you would have a rule by a tiny group of people who didn't believe in democracy, who didn't believe that anybody could ever lose an election, their party could ever lose an election. We just got big problems. So I guess what I'm saying is, this is a long-winded way of saying is there's just so much going on right now that I don't think I can say that what's happening now with Black people in this conversation, I don't know where it's going to go, because I don't know where the country is going to go. I really don't. I'm stunned to see so many people who would be willing to throw out our system for a person, for a personality. And we got to figure out what's going to happen with that. And then I'll have a better sense of what this conversation, the conversation about race, where that's going to go.
So I could have this conversation with you all afternoon. And I want to give those who are present with us at the Urban League an opportunity to ask any questions they may have, and those who are online. So do you all have any questions for Annette? If not, I got a whole list of them. So I do have this question. You mentioned that history is your forte, and quite frankly, you've done an incredible job of marrying history and law
Mhm.
in your writing, in your scholarship, what came first for you, history or the law?
History. History came first for me. Even growing up, I loved my history classes. I read history on my own. I'm just fascinated by it. And I think
Froze.
it has, pardon me, can you hear me? Did I freeze?
Oh, Mama.
Am I frozen? Hello, can you hear me? Can you hear me now?
We're gonna pause for technical difficulties. That
Can
never
you-
happens on Zoom.
You can't hear me?
Those online can hear you. I think it's the people present.
Okay, the people online can hear me, but okay. Can you, Karen, can you hear me now?
Okay, yes, I've got you.
Okay, so you're back. So you can hear me now?
I can hear you. Can you
Okay.
hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, so the question is, you talked about history being your forte.
Mhm.
And, you know, you've done an incredible job of marrying history and the law,
Mhm.
especially in your scholarship. So for you, what came first?
Well-
Your love of history or your love of law?
Well, my love of history came first. And before that, my love of writing came before that. I always thought of myself, I thought I would be a writer, that I would be in a profession where I was a writer. And I thought of being, you know, an essayist, a novelist, a journalist. But the law came because it seemed more practical and because my father wanted me to go to law school. My father admired lawyers. And I think if he'd had the chance to do that, that's something he would have liked to do. So a part of it was pleasing my father, I think. And I also, you know, I had the experience of integrating our town's schools when I went to first grade. And I knew what lawyers did. So early on, I understood, you know, what lawyers did. And then later, when I thought of law as a more practical career, I remembered that it was lawyers who made desegregation possible. And I was part of that process because I integrated school. So, but that too was tied to history because I had to think about why that was the case. Why was it a big deal that a Black kid went to school with white kids? You know, why did it take lawyers to make that happen? So I guess if I think about it, all of them, you know, at one point in my life, they all sort of came together. And that's why I decided to go into law.
Well, we have a question in the back of the room. Yes, sir.
Okay, good afternoon. My name is Dr. Wale Idris, the publisher of Africa USA.
Yes.
I have never read this book, but it sounds very interesting. Imagine history, law, religion. So how can I get contact with her to promote the book?
So
You have to
we
repeat
have
that.
a publisher of Africa USA Today
Mhm.
in the room with us, and he wants to know how to get your book. And as I understand it, it's widely available. In fact, we have one for all of our nextONE participants, as well as for the members of our staff and our panelists.
You can,
Is
Amazon.
it generally available
Oh, yeah.
wherever?
Yes, it's everywhere. Barnes and Noble, Amazon, Barnes and Noble online, and independent bookstores. If there are Black bookstores in Chicago, I presume. And if you want to go independent, it should be there as well. But surely, any Barnes and Noble or Amazon online, you can get the book.
So I did mine on online so I could read it, but I also got a hard copy.
Uh-huh.
Any other questions? What is your next project? Your next book?
My next project is a second volume of the Hemings family story. I'm going to talk about their lives after they leave Monticello, take them through the 19th century, the Civil War, and drop them off at the beginning of the 20th century and be done with it there. So that's the next project, the next generation of people. Some of them go into stay in the Black community. Some of them go into the white community. And it's an interesting way of looking at, the courses of their lives based upon that decision. People who come from the same place, except some say, we're white and some say we're Black. And obviously they have different trajectories in life because of that.
So, I have to ask this. Any prospect of turning that into television?
Yes, we're talking to some people now about that. But things got interrupted with the pandemic. There were, strangely enough, people in England who were very, very interested in this. But what has happened the past year put everything on pause. So we're ready to start back up the process again. But that would be really nice. I think it's a great story, and it would be good on television. A movie is too much stuff for just one movie. A series would be better, and that's the conclusion that we came to, and that's what we're in the process of talking to people about now.
So there's another Dartmouth alum who has taken historic television by storm with Bridgerton. So maybe that's a possibility for sure.
Yeah.
So is there other hidden history about the Black experience in the United States that needs the spotlight in a similar way to Juneteenth?
Well, I think one of the things that interests me is, and someone has written about this, but I don't think it's known enough about how there were other kinds of Tulsas, situations where Black people were basically run out of town. I remember a person did some looking at the census in certain counties. There would be a certain percentage of Black people in 1 year. 10 years later, you look at the census and there's none. And then you look around the newspapers and you see, and people talked openly about, we basically ran the Black people out. And I don't think that people see, part of it is that people don't know the kinds of things that that happen to Black people, and in my grandparents' town where, Black people, there was a curfew for Black people who are citizens, right? Who pay taxes, had to be indoors by a certain period of time. And it was sort of like an informal thing, but white people took it upon themselves to police Black people in that way. And I think that those actions should be known, better known, because people think that we're making stuff up about the past and the kinds of things that happen. So that's not so much hidden, but I don't think it's emphasized enough how there were all kinds of constitutional violations, violations of Black people's constitutional rights all throughout, say, the 20th century, and even in the second half of the 20th century. And some people, if you count police violence in some ways, it's up until now. But people need to know about what happened in those little towns and those places throughout the South and other places as well, too, where Black people didn't have the opportunity to move as actual equal citizens through the landscape, the American landscape.
So you talked about the the wrongs and the difficulties and just the brutality that Black people have faced throughout the course of history.
Mhm.
Given that lengthy history, why do you think there is such difficulty making a case for reparations?
Because people don't believe that this has anything to do with them. You know, they're saying this happened in the past. Other bad things happened to people in the past. And therefore, therefore there's nothing special about our situation that merits it. People feel that they have no connection to it, which is wrong, but they feel that they have no connection to all of this, and they don't want to pay, even though what happened in the past created lots of privileges and advantages that they benefit from today, but they don't want to acknowledge that. That would require saying, I mean, there's such a premium on suggesting that everything is fair. And the things that people have, they got as a result of their own merit with no privilege, nothing, no advantages. And they don't see the hidden advantages. When you talk about reparations, that attacks that notion, I think, of innocence and of meritocracy. And I mean, that's what I think. That's why there's an opposition to it. And plus hostility on the part of some people, just plain hostility towards people of African descent. But I think in the main, it's more, we had nothing to do with this. Everything we have, we've gotten fair and square. There are no privileges for people who are white, and there are no disadvantages for people who are Black. And it's just sort of a denial of the reality of history.
Annette, I know you have a tight schedule today. We have one more question, and this again is from our audience.
Mhm.
Juneteenth is typically celebrated with a cookout similar to July 4th.
Mhm.
Now that it is a federal holiday,
Mhm.
how can we ensure that we don't lose the commemoration part of this day and the significance that it has for ongoing struggle for equity for Black people?
Well, I think you can, by participating in events that make the point about the real meaning of Juneteenth, sponsoring those kinds of events. Cookouts are great. You know, we love them. When I was barbecuing and stuff and drinking red soda water when we were growing up, we like to do that. But make sure that you support efforts on the part of people to make it also a day of education. And this requires individuals to volunteer to do these kinds of things. And when you see people who are creating activities for young people, events like this, or other things where there are poetry readings, music, all those kinds of things, that readings and speeches, which is what they used to do at Juneteenth at Emancipation Park, participate in those kinds of things. If others are not doing them, try to do some of these things yourself. I mean, it's going to be commercialized. There's no question that there will be, sales, mattress sales, and all the kinds of stuff that comes, and car sales that come with all this stuff. But we have to ride herd on this. And we can do it by making sure that we plan activities for our children and attend the activities that people do plan to commemorate this, and make sure you're active in that front. Don't be passive and say, well, we can't be passive and say that they're just going to take it over and it'll be meaningless in a few years. It will if we don't stand up and make the day what we want it to be.
Thank you so much for joining us today. I cannot tell you how proud I am of you, and to have known.
I'm proud of you too, Karen, for heaven's sake.
Well, I appreciate it, and just the way that you have brought history to life for so many of us in so many areas. So congratulations on your latest New York Times bestseller, and we can't wait for the next one.
Thank you so much. Thank you for inviting me.
Take care.
Okay, goodbye.
All right, well, I'm gonna call Sharon back up to give us our next steps, but before I do, I just want to thank you all for starting the day with us, and thank you for, as I said earlier, entrusting your businesses to us as we relaunch the nextONE initiative. I am looking forward to getting to know you and your businesses over the next 9 months, and seeing you have the success that we have seen from our panelists here today. So have a great day.